Seriously though, I could frame any one of you in a dark corner and capture you in a moment of desperation. And any one of you could do that to me. Me.
Life is Strange is a video game series I always find myself coming back to, and with its complex mix of drama, mystery, social commentary, and superpowers, it's developed quite a strong fan base, captivating a lot more people than just myself. Taking center stage in each entry is the series' biggest selling point, player choice. Life is Strange revels in giving the player the freedom to do or say whatever it is we feel like when prompted to, and once that choice is made, the game never hesitates to remind us that these choices have consequences. But it's here that we'll find one of the biggest issues with the series. Though it's true that choices are very important in all of the games, a lot of the choices we make don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Despite coming out of the closet at full throttle, the later games never reached the heights that the first game did, and the best way to figure out why would be to analyze each and every game in the franchise. So let's look lovingly at the lethargic but lucrative legacy of Life is Strange. There's not enough people with originality, so here I am to save the day, Jaynalysis. The year is 2015, and store shelves are cluttered with a bunch of sad and serious men. And Mario. Along comes the developer of the oh-so-ironically titled Capcom game with an idea for something different, a choice-based graphic adventure game that follows the lives of high school students in a small town full of mystery, drama, and, dare I say, life. Taking the lead in this episodic tale is our protagonist, Maxine Caulfield, an introverted and introspective loner with a passion for photography. And it was during my 13-hour playthrough, which I will be doing again on Twitch for the remaster, so go follow me there, that I noticed what makes Max so compelling: her personality. She uses music to isolate herself, she makes self-deprecating comments every now and then, and as we learn throughout the story, Max used to be quite apathetic to things around her. The game does a great job of establishing who Max is, or rather was, before we, the players, start taking control. Not by telling us, but by showing us. The way characters interact with her, the way she carries herself, and even what she writes in her journal. All of these elements paint a pretty picture. Because Max keeps a lot of her thoughts to herself, it makes sense that she'd have all this internal dialogue when interacting with the world around her. Her student profile even tells us that Max is in an individualized education program. Did you know that? Huh? Did you? Her character flaw being indifference, whether through insecurity or, in some cases, ignorance, lends itself well to the game's core mechanic of rewinding time. Max, a character that has a hard time socializing, gains the ability to undo anything wrong in her conversations, and it's with this newfound invincibility that the player is able to mold Max into who they see fit. Will Max use her powers selfishly to climb the social ladders perpetuated by the Vortex Club, or will she use them to better herself and improve her relationships with people she previously made little effort towards? Regardless, Max's rewind powers are expanded on as the game progresses, freezing time to prevent a student's death, time traveling to alternate realities, and even exploring physical manifestations of her psyche. Of all the powers presented in the franchise, Max's is without a doubt the best, especially for a choice-based adventure game. And the funny thing is, we don't even know where her powers come from, just that they manifested when she experienced something tragic. After witnessing the murder of a mysterious woman, Max rewinds time for the first time. Upon realizing this, she prevents the murder from ever taking place, thus kicking off the figurative and literal storm of consequences. We soon discover that this mysterious woman is Max's former best friend, Chloe, who Max ghosted after moving away from her years ago. After saving Chloe from dying numerous times, we learn that by saving her, we've altered reality so hard that it creates a tornado that will only destroy our humble town of Arcadia Bay. And, this is one of the weirdest things about this game. You see, through its entirety, the game makes every effort to remind us that our choices have consequences. But in every situation, we have to save Chloe in order for the plot to progress. And this wouldn't be as bad if it weren't for the final choice. At the end of the game, after spending upwards of 12 hours getting to know everyone and getting to see the results of all of our choices, we're given an ultimatum of either sacrificing Chloe or sacrificing Arcadia Bay. Choosing to sacrifice Chloe has us traveling to the very beginning of the game and letting her die, thus making all of our actions completely pointless. Sure, Max keeps her memories of everything that happened, so she can report her evidence for Rachel's disappearance to the police, but what better way to tell the audience their choices don't matter than by literally undoing them all? And you can tell this was the intended ending because if we choose to sacrifice Arcadia Bay, we're welcomed to a very brief epilogue with no closure, leaving the audience with many unanswered questions. Does Max still have her powers? Will more catastrophes strike if she keeps using them? Was the storm only caused by saving Chloe's life, or did saving Kate's life also have something to do with it? I guess we'll never know. The only certainty is that Chloe either lives or dies, which can also be a bit polarizing, because, how do I put it nicely? Chloe is a terrible friend. After Max tells Chloe about her newfound ability to rewind time, the first thing Chloe thinks of is how she can take advantage of Max's powers to benefit herself. Now, sure, we gradually learn that Chloe's antagonistic behavior comes from a place of domestic trauma, but in order to land any potential romance with her, we're forced to go along with some of her illegal plans. Which brings us to a very special choice in Life is Strange, who we decide to romance. A very prominent feature in the Life is Strange franchise is its non-hetero representation. Our protagonist, Max, is bisexual, and her two romantic options are Chloe and Warren. Though other games have done this before, it still wasn't very common at the time, so Life is Strange did a fantastic job at treating these relationships like normal, non-fetishized relationships. The only problem is, well, personally, I don't like either of my options. Chloe seems like a selfish lover, and I'm not settling for boring Warren, am I right? So, in my first playthrough, I chose neither. But what I find particularly interesting is this is the only Life is Strange game that gives us the option to choose both simultaneously. Though technically, the Warren route gets undone no matter what you do. But hey, points for letting the player choose their own narrative, regardless of how immoral our cheating may be. Speaking of narrative, something that helped carry this game during its release was its episodic nature. The entire game was split into 5 episodes, each being a continuation of the one that came before it. They were released sporadically between January and October of 2015, giving time for hype, fan theories, speculations, and, you guessed it, analysis videos. Because of this, each individual episode had to be compelling enough for the audience to want to purchase the next installment. So what better way to do this than by having an overarching murder mystery that slowly unravels, revealing the truth about each and every character we interact with. Sure, we have time powers and go on adventures with our ex-best friend, but solving the disappearance of former Blackwell student Rachel Ambers is what drives the plot forward. Add a variety of characters with layers and intel on the whereabouts of Rachel before she disappeared, and you have a game that never feels like it's wasting time. Mostly. The fact that Max is someone that never came into contact with Rachel allows her to play the role of audience surrogate. When Max learns something new, we learn something new, and the more we explore the environment and exploit our rewind powers, the more we learn. As for how Max gets involved, well, we can thank Chloe, who grew very close to Rachel during Max's absence. Max, feeling guilty for abandoning Chloe in the past, chooses to help her figure out what happened to Rachel. Everything services both the narrative and the characters. Having it all take place in a small town helps us learn more about the neighborhood as the story progresses, without ever losing track of who's who and why we're doing what we're doing. Adding a certain degree of cadence to the melancholic town of Arcadia Bay is the game's soundtrack. Mixing an original score with licensed music placed at appropriate times creates an atmosphere of dejected bliss that later games try to replicate but never quite get right. There's a difference between being poignant and being pretentious, and I think the first game is the only one that ever truly understood that. Though at times it dips its toes into the latter, it never strays too far away from the former. There's no cookie-cutter flashbacks or lazily written dream sequences. No, in this game, everything serves its purpose, and I wish I could say the same for its prequel.
One joint every morning and one every day. Then a couple more to make the blues go away. I used a couple in the evening and one just before bed. And this is my recipe for never feeling sad, 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 sad.
You'll find it quite difficult to write a choice-based game about a character that's already been established, especially when said game takes place before the events the audience is familiar with. Why would our choices matter if we already know what's going to happen? It's not like we could magically undo what happened in the first game again. The Life is Strange prequel, Before the Storm, attempts to alleviate this by diving deeper into the posthumous character Rachel Ambers. The only problem is, we don't play as her. Instead, we're thrown into the shoes of the antisocial, foul-mouthed rebel Chloe Price. Now, in the first game, most of the story beats revolved around Chloe, her dysfunctional family, and her relationship with Rachel being two big highlights. She also proved to be quite popular among fans, so from a marketing standpoint, it makes perfect sense to give players the ability to hella play the life of Chloe. But we already know what's going to happen to her. We know she gets expelled. We know she had a great relationship with her biological father. We know she gets a star tattoo. The fact that we can even choose not to get the tattoo is such a joke. Even stranger is Chloe's superpower. While Max could rewind time to manipulate conversations, Chloe just argues with people. When the game prompts her to, that is. The backtalk mechanic is pretty weak, because in most situations, this teenager should not be getting her way simply because she outsnarks the adults around her. Humorously, if the player chooses not to talk back, Chloe reluctantly becomes nice. And here lies the problem with the choices in this game. No matter how nice we choose to play Chloe, she's still going to be the angsty teen we know and no by the time Max returns. And it's for this exact reason why I think Before the Storm's lead should have been Rachel. In the first game, we're only given a few details about who she was before she disappeared, and because these details come from varying sources with varying degrees of reliability, the only thing truly set in stone is that she disappears. Had Rachel been the character players took control of, we'd be given a blank slate. We could shape Rachel into who we want her to be without ever tampering with the previously established narrative. Characters reminisce about how awesome she was. We could decide what they mean by this. Did they think this because of her empathetic heroism, always going out of her way to help those around her? Or was it because she was an unrepentant rebel that did whatever she wanted? The player's choices could build on the mysticism of Rachel as the story progressed, and maybe, just maybe, they'd be able to use an actual power. There's been wide debate in the fanbase on whether or not Rachel actually has any powers. Assuming she does, the game's pretty ambiguous about what they are. Can she control the weather? Can she control fire? Is she related to the storm somehow, or is she just a great manipulator? You decide. I'm not here to theorize, I'm here to analyze. This time around, Rachel is our only romantic option, which makes sense in the context of the story. That being said, we never learn why Rachel does what she does. Sure, we later learn about her estranged mother, but we learn about it the same time Rachel does. So before that, was she just rebelling for the sake of it? And for all the hype there is about Rachel wanting to leave Arcadia Bay, we never learn exactly why. Is it because she's in too deep with the wrong crowd? Like Frank, who, if the first game is anything to go by, would suggest that Rachel may have only seen Chloe as a shoulder to cry on and nothing more. Maybe she genuinely loved Chloe and her feelings slowly faded? Look, ambiguity is cool and all, but man, I finished this prequel with more questions than answers. Again, something that could have potentially been alleviated had we taken control of Rachel. Instead, we have Chloe interacting with Frank, her stepfather David, and a lot of these interactions can be watered down to one of two things. Either A, Chloe likes the character and proceeds to spend a chunk of time with them, or B, Chloe doesn't like the character and proceeds to snark at them. Driven by her insecurities, Chloe has her guards up almost all the time, which, though justified, can get pretty old pretty quickly. Which is why her willingness to go along with Rachel's schemes is a breath of fresh air. After losing her best friend Max, Chloe sparks a new friendship with Rachel that gradually turns into love. So when Rachel disappears and Max reappears, it makes sense why Chloe would cling to Max so aggressively. She's lost everything and doesn't want to experience that again. Before the Storm gives us reason to believe why Chloe is the way she is in the first game, even going so far as showing her interact with her biological father, William. But since he's dead by the time the prequel starts, it's through dream sequences and illusions in Chloe's mind. Personally, I've never been a big fan of this kind of storytelling, simply because it blurs the line between the two characters present. Was William always a father figure that gave sagely advice to Chloe when he was alive? Or is Chloe romanticizing how great he was in an effort to preserve her own biased memories about him, all while ignoring anything bad he may have potentially done? It's hard to tell because it's all from Chloe's perspective. With one exception, in the Farewell DLC, we take control of Max in a prequel to the prequel. Chloe and Max are kids again, and they talk about growing up, and Max has a hard time telling Chloe that she's moving away, only to discover that she already knew. But things only get harder as the story progresses. If you look at the setting and even some pictures in the background, you'll slowly start to realize that this chapter we're playing is just moments before William's death. And even though I saw this coming, I still wasn't ready. Full disclosure, I'm not the biggest fan of Before the Storm. Most of it feels like filler, but this scene reminded me why I unironically love this series so much. When the game stops flexing its fake choices, stops forcing us to frolic on stage, stops talking. It's a freaking masterpiece. The cringe fades away, the outdated dialogue is silenced, and at the mercy of a soundtrack put together by someone who cared about what they were doing. Though I do find it a bit strange that punk rocker Chloe hardly listens to any punk rock, I'm willing to forgive it all when the franchise stays focused. And focused it does not remain. So far, the 2 games in the franchise have tackled themes of bullying, domestic abuse, and consequences from the perspective of young adults in high school. So you can imagine the surprise of fans once they learned that the next official installment was a standalone, single-episode game about a 9-year-old coping with the loss of his mother. Enter Chris Erickson, a kid with an imagination so vivid it extends what would realistically be 30 minutes in real time to 2 hours of gameplay. Chris fantasizes about what it'd be like to be a superhero, with a moral code, secret layers, and superpowers, all while calling himself Captain Spirit. From the get-go, the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit make it clear that the Life is Strange franchise isn't tied exclusively to Max and Chloe. Though this drastic departure may not have been ideal, it was a clear indication of what's to come. Anyway, in this story we follow Chris, creating his own adventures around his house. All seems fine until we meet his father, Charles, a disgruntled widower who takes his frustrations out on Chris while under the influence of alcohol. As you may have guessed, Chris's heroic fantasies of good triumphing over evil may be projecting a bit of his real-life traumas. Chris loves his father and sees him as a good person, but as dialogue would suggest, his father does a lot of bad things. Chris copes with his father's physical and verbal abuse by going on adventures as Captain Spirit. When Chris is a superhero, there's a clear divide between good and evil. The heroes never do bad things, and the villains never do good things. In Chris's fantasies, everything is metaphorically black and white, which makes sense. Chris is a 9-year-old obsessed with the heroes he reads about in comics and watches on TV. He doesn't understand why child services are trying to take him away from his father, and why their neighbor Claire keeps coming over to see if everything's okay. In his innocent mind, his dad is just going through a hard time, and even though he hurts Chris, he's still a good person through and through. Of all the stories Life is Strange has told, this one stands out as quite an oddity. While playing the game at the time of release, I couldn't help but wonder, why? Why are we learning about Chris's home life? Why are we pretending to have superpowers? Why are we playing dress-up? Why does any of this matter? Is this the setup to Life is Strange 2? Is this showing us the childhood of the next game's protagonist, so we have an idea of where he's coming from before we're thrusted into his adult life in the sequel? Or, as many of my friends and I thought, is Chris going to be the antagonist of Life is Strange 2? No joke, we honestly thought that this game was a clever way to set up a sympathetic villain for the next game. A kid who's blamed for the death of his mother and gains a warped perspective of right and wrong from his abusive father. A child who idolized superheroes in fiction and in an attempt to emulate their heroics slowly learned that the world isn't so black and white, ultimately rejecting the way the world works and pushing his own moral philosophy on anyone who disagrees with him. How would he do this? With his superpowers, of course. Throughout the game, the player is prompted to use Chris's powers on a variety of household objects, often resulting in Chris using telekinesis to interact with said object, before revealing that he's just pretending. That is, until the game's finale, where after running away from his father, Chris falls from a ladder to his treehouse, but before hitting the ground, he stops in mid-air. He looks to the neighbors who saw him and roll credits. Because of the ambiguity of the situation, it was hard to tell whether or not Chris had unlocked telekinetic powers due to his trauma. It wouldn't be the first time that happened in this series, though this time would be a little different. Unlike Max, Chris would have gained his powers from a young age, and by the time of Life is Strange 2, perhaps we could have seen a grown-up Chris with plenty of experience with these powers. Would Chris seek revenge against his father and slowly become more and more jaded as the story progressed? Or would he still hold on to his moral compass, vowing to only use his powers for what he saw as good? How could telekinetic abilities affect a choice-based game? There were a lot of questions and a lot of speculations about what would happen next. But what we knew for sure was that the series was going in a new direction, without completely abandoning the themes that made it so popular. And it also started showing some of the problems the series would later be known for. Now, follow me here. The original Life is Strange, though not perfect, captured an audience with its setting, music, and characters, but it was held back by dialogue that felt unnatural, episodes that had too much padding, and some of our choices not really holding much weight in the grand scheme of things. After all this speculation about who Chris is and how he tied into the narrative of Life is Strange 2, it sucked learning that ultimately only two things mattered in this 2-hour game: the costume we create for Chris and him witnessing telekinetic powers. You could argue that Claire's involvement is relevant too, but you'd be wrong. By the second game, we have a brief mention of it, and that's it. It contributes nothing to the plot. Speaking of which, have you noticed I only mentioned Chris's mom like twice in this video? That's because she's not a character, she's a plot device. Again, though this isn't the first time this has happened in the series, the disappearance of Rachel Ambers is a good example, I feel it was handled better there. Mostly because it did more than just give characters a reason to argue. Here, Chris's mom, Emily, was an artist that graduated from Blackwell Academy years before our dynamic duo ever attended. She got pregnant during college, moved away, and had Chris with Charles. Then, for some reason related to Chris, she went out one night and was struck by a car. Chris and his dad don't decorate their house for Christmas because it brings back memories of Emily. Chris's dad even says just looking at Chris reminds him of her. And that's it. That's all we know about her. It would have been nice to have explored what she meant to Chris. We know she's a comic book artist, so I guess we can assume that she got Chris into comic books? This would add a bit more character to Chris as well, seeing his obsession with superheroes being more than just a childlike fantasy. Perhaps, deep down, he clings to comics because of his mother's passion for art. Unfortunately, this is just an assumption. All we know is that Chris lost his mother and that he misses his mother. I just wish more was done with this. Maybe she'll play a bigger role in a later installment? Who knows? All we know for sure is, whoever worked on The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit must have really loved Death with Dignity by Sufjan Stevens, cause the song plays so many times in this game, it was hard not to notice. But honestly, it's a great theme for Chris, free-spirited and melancholic, bittersweet symbolism of losing one's innocence, and a chilling bit of foreshadowing for what comes next.
We're brothers, we're happy and we're singing and we're colored. Give me a high five!
So, you have a successful franchise predominantly rooted in mystery, representation, and your superpowers that takes place in a setting that most players can relate to instantly: high school. It's an easy justification for revisiting the same location and why characters don't venture too far out of town. So what do you do for the sequel? Literally none of that. In an attempt to distinguish itself from its predecessor, Life is Strange 2 goes out of its way to be different. And in many ways, Life is Strange 2 is a valuable lesson in not going too far in the opposite direction. Instead of a murder mystery, it's a political coming-of-age story about two boys on the run. The most glaring issue with this plot is the fact that it prevents any sort of character development for anyone who doesn't tag along with our main characters. And guess what? No one does. Because each episode of Life is Strange 2 takes place in a different location, we learn about the supporting cast through letters, newspapers, and brief pieces of dialogue before moving on from them entirely. With such an unfocused narrative, the player is forced to put all their focus on the relationship between the Diaz brothers, Sean and Daniel. After the tragic death of their father Esteban, the two make a mad dash to the US border in an attempt to find a peaceful life in Mexico. On their way, they encounter stoners, religious cults, and lots of racism. Replaying all of these games with the benefit of hindsight made me realize just how off-putting the political commentary in Life is Strange 2 can be. Not because its commentary on the mistreatment of immigrants is incorrect, but because any degree of racism experienced by our protagonists is always very unsubtle. The few times Life is Strange 1 commented on anything political, it was never too over the top. But here, we literally have a character say, "Everything is political, Sean," and pretty much every old man we meet has a blunt line of dialogue expressing how much they dislike immigrants. And you know what's even weirder? This game that comments on America's cultural relationships wasn't even written by Americans. Need I say more? Sure, I just spent the last 2 pages dissecting why this game doesn't really work narratively, but it may surprise you to know that I actually like Life is Strange 2. Well, most of it. It's not perfect, but the one thing it does better than any other game in the franchise is making the player's choices actually matter. This thumbnail is a lie. In this game, we take control of 16-year-old Sean Diaz as he tries to figure himself out while also acting as a parent to his 9-year-old brother, Daniel. Sean is a weird character. Because of the game's plot, we only get a small idea of who he was before he was on the run. He has a close relationship with his family, but bullies his little brother. He's not doing well in school despite his best efforts. He likes partying, he smokes, he has a crush on a cat girl, and he loves drawing anthropomorphic animals. Is Sean a furry? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. I'd actually love to hear your thoughts. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, Sean is an incredibly average guy. What makes him interesting isn't who he was at the beginning, but rather who we shape him into by the end. Regardless of what we choose, the only consistent character trait is his instinct to protect his little brother, Daniel. Now, if you thought Sean was bland, let me tell you something about Daniel. After experiencing the traumatic death of his father, Daniel unlocks his true potential and proceeds to be an incredible brat for the first 3 episodes. Though, admittedly, it is justified. A reminder that Daniel is 9 at the beginning of the game, and he's experiencing the tragedies of homelessness firsthand. His juvenile lifestyle was taken away from him in the blink of an eye. I'd be mad too, but the most interesting thing about Daniel is his superpower. Before the game was even announced, I remember my friends and I wondering what other powers could work in a choice-based game like Life is Strange. The best we could come up with was mind reading, because, you know, that makes sense. What did the developers come up with? Telekinesis. Alright. But wait, it gets better. We only get to use it when the game lets us. Why? Because, as I said earlier, we control Sean, not Daniel. So, what's Sean's power? You, me, and everyone asked? Well, technically, hammer space, but I guess everyone can do that in the series? No, Sean doesn't have any powers. Yeah, in this direct sequel to Life is Strange, we don't get to use our own powers. Instead, we incentivize Daniel to either use his powers helpfully or selfishly. Now, I know this sounds lame, but it's actually a pretty clever way of making our choices matter. You see, the way we treat Daniel determines how much he respects Sean as his big brother. If we choose to bully Daniel and be a bad big brother, he'll often ignore our requests and use his powers however he wants to. But if we treat him nicely, he actually listens to us, sometimes even just taking the initiative. You'd think this would force players to just be kind to Daniel, but there is some merit to not always being a saint. Other pivotal choice options present themselves if instead of constantly protecting Daniel, we teach him to be more reckless and fend for himself, which is a really nice way of saying Daniel's more willing to kill people. It's a fun concept having your choice determine how Daniel's powers develop, Be good and he focuses on precision. Be bad and he focuses on destruction. But this is taken even further by having our choices be tied to more than just what button we press when the game prompts us to. As early as the first episode, Daniel may need our help, but we won't know that if we don't pay attention to him. Our in-game actions actually have consequences, however minor they may be. Fortunately, though, not all of our choices revolve around Daniel. One great example of choices being meaningful is whether or not Sean keeps in touch with his best friend Lila. If he does, Lila does her best to update Sean about how things are going during his absence. When pressured by authorities, Lila protects him and Daniel, and depending on which ending you get, Lila will be there to comfort Sean. Choosing not to keep in touch with her results in Lila being hospitalized after having a serious mental breakdown from the loss of her best friend. Whether platonic or romantic, Lila loves Sean, and she wants to be there with him. It's honestly beautiful, and it irritates me that no matter which ending you get, you're never paired with her. No, instead, you're forced to be with either Cassidy or Finn. And when I say forced, I mean it. During my playthrough, in the hopes of romancing Lila, I avoided interacting with Finn and Cassidy as much as I could. But somehow, I still ended up with Cassidy in my ending. This is especially irritating because Finn and Cassidy aren't, ideal? In order to romance Finn, you have to go along with this plan that involves endangering a child he hardly knows. Sean has to abandon any concern he has for Daniel to date this free spirit that wants to steal money. For a series so heavily involved with positive representation, why do the non-hetero relationships involve the player committing crimes? It's a weird thing I noticed while playing these games again. On top of that, Finn's character makes no sense. On multiple occasions, he's referred to as the leader of his band of misfits. Sure, he's charismatic, but we never actually see him display these feats of leadership. The most interesting thing about Finn comes with the choices made around his plan. It's possible for Finn to die, and though the impact it has on the story is nowhere near as substantial as Kate Marsh from the first game, it doesn't make it any less intriguing. Unlike, say, Cassidy. Now, between the two, I much prefer Cassidy. She seems a lot more level-headed despite having a tragic backstory involving her abusive and addictive father. I think it's especially interesting that when reading her file, you'll notice that Cassidy isn't even her real name. My one gripe with Cassidy is how little she contributes as far as the player choice is concerned. She can go along with Sean and Finn's heist and potentially get hurt by Daniel, or she can just not come at all. Sean can kiss Cassidy, Sean can sleep with Cassidy, he can do both, or he can do neither. That's it. And if the player does choose to go all the way with her, the only instance of her returning is in the final episode, depending on the choices the player makes. Unlike Finn, who has the potential to show up in episodes 2 to 5. Also not helping matters is the fact that they're introduced in episode 2, but we work with them in episode 3. And we're just supposed to care. We're just supposed to act like we've known them for a while, because all of that development that is there took place off-screen. This game has a serious problem with that. Each episode kind of just drops us in the middle of whatever Sean and Daniel were doing between episodes. Because of this, it's harder to get a grasp on why and how they got there, which can be quite problematic once we get to the game's finale. While being interrogated, Sean is asked why he ran away. The player has a choice in how Sean responds, but it really made me wonder why the game hardly addressed this before. Why did Sean run at the beginning of the game? He seems to think no one would have believed that Daniel caused the explosion, but not only is there video evidence, Daniel could just show them his powers. But I guess Sean would worry that the government would experiment on Daniel if he showed them, so better to keep it secret, I guess? This game has 7 endings, and in a few of them, Sean gets arrested regardless, so maybe he was right to run. Either way, having this many endings proved quite promising, despite all the choppy pacing. Admirably, this game starts each episode with a recap of what happened in the previous one, cleverly framed as a story being told to Daniel while being narrated and illustrated by Sean. Not gonna lie, by the end of the game I was expecting a big reveal where we see Sean writing a book or something, but nah, the game just ends without ever addressing it as more than just a framing device. Real missed opportunity. Unfortunately, these choice-sensitive innovations weren't enough to keep this game afloat, so in an attempt to recapture the magic of the first entry, they decided to take a few steps back. And what we got was interesting.
Stay
Stay
the fuck away from her!
away from
What'd you say? Tilly dawn! 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 Tilly dawn!
There's a common trend in trilogies that I don't think gets thought of much. In almost every franchise, the third part calls back to the first in some way, shape, or form. Such is the case with Life is Strange True Colors. Interesting that they chose not to call it Life is Strange 3. Even more interesting is the fact that this is the first mainline Life is Strange game not to be developed by Don't Nod. Instead, it was given to Deck 9, the developers responsible for the prequel Before the Storm. After learning this, it came as no surprise to me that they'd be bringing back a character from their Life is Strange game, and sure enough, they did. But alas, Steph Gingrich is not the protagonist of True Colors. Instead, we have Alex Chen, the socially awkward music lover that plays guitar and has struggled with varying degrees of apathy. Sound familiar? Remember how I said the third installment always calls back to the first? Well, look no further than our protagonist and the plot. After criticism of Sean's character being so drastically different from Max, it seems the developers thought it'd be best to go back to familiar territory. That being said, they did a wonderful job of making sure Alex isn't just a carbon copy of Max. For starters, Alex is the first Life is Strange protagonist that has experience with her powers from the get-go, and a big reason for her standoffish personality is the result of said powers. Alex frequently avoids eye contact, and in some cases, even physical contact. She has a hard time opening up to people even if she's known them her whole life. Expressing herself with every chord, she writes music to help her cope with childhood traumas. The only problem is, the game hardly explores this trauma. Not even kidding, a lot of things are hinted at throughout the first 2 episodes, but we don't get any real insight until the final episode, and by that point, it felt much too late. And kind of confusing. From what I could gather, Alex and her brother Gabe became orphans after their mother died of cancer. Their father didn't think he was fit to raise them, so he sent them to a foster care system. Alex and Gabe were sent to multiple group homes and foster parents, eventually resulting in Gabe being sent to juvie for stealing a car. Alex continued to be transferred from home to home and eventually made it to Haven Springs, the setting of this game. You see how disjointed that whole paragraph was? The game doesn't present it any better. All this information is just thrown on the audience at once at the end of the game. We're given no time to understand Gabe and Alex's relationship, no time to experience how Alex slowly distances herself from people, no time to discover the different ways Alex's life was impacted by her power. But we have plenty of time for LARPing. It's such a shame too, because honestly, playing through Alex's entire backstory would create a way more interesting game. Case in point, while looking through Alex's text messages, a keen player might notice that Alex was involved with a guy named Isaac while she was still in foster care. After sleeping together, Alex feels repulsed and tells him she wasn't in the right mindset and wants to hold off, while Isaac says the night was incredible. Alex blocks Isaac. Now, this may seem like a normal case of post-coital clarity, but let me ask you something. What's Alex's power? Empathy. The ability to literally feel what other people are feeling. Isaac wanted Alex didn't want Isaac, but then suddenly her power activated. Now, because she can feel Isaac's desire for her, she developed a desire for him, whether she wanted to or not. The two sleep together, and it's only after that that her power deactivates. Alex is a victim of sexual abuse. All those little moments of her avoiding eye contact and intimacy seem to make even more sense with that information. It's really tragic and even helps explain why Alex wouldn't want to use her powers at every given opportunity. So why is this only a text message? Why is this completely skippable? Why are all these important details about Alex in the background? Instead of any of that development, we have Alex magically learning that she can do more than just empathize. Alright, real quick, let's break down Alex's power, or more accurately, powers. She can see fear, anger, sorrow, and joy manifest as colors around a person. She can feel one of those 4 emotions when a person near her is experiencing them. She can read people's minds, but only when they feel one of those 4 emotions. She can hear the history of inanimate objects. Yeah, that one's weird. She can take away people's emotions, rendering them emotionless, and she can unconsciously create hallucinations for herself when the weight of her emotions is too intense. So intense that the microphone peaks every time she screams. Did anyone else notice that? Like, come on. Because Alex's power of empathy is, well, pretty overpowered if you think about it, the player is only allowed to use it when the game prompts them to. Fortunately, this is consistent in the story as well. Alex is only able to use her powers when she sees a person's aura. She can't just read minds willy-nilly. Let's not forget that in the past, using her powers led to a traumatic experience, so it's easy to understand why she hasn't gotten a complete grasp on them yet. I just wish her powers were used more for the sake of the plot. Once again, we have a murder mystery, but this time, instead of it being a teacher and student, it's a big corporation, and a person called a person, and someone didn't listen, so someone died. In the first game, Max and Chloe had to get their hands dirty and do some of the investigating for themselves. But in this game, Alex, Steph, and Ryan just need to steal a USB drive that has all of the information they need already on it. Again, how much more interesting would it be if Alex had to bluff people in an attempt to read their minds and see what's going on, leaving the player to solve the puzzle for themselves with all of that information? Maybe there could be a mind journal that keeps track of every internal dialogue from each individual around Haven Springs. Seriously, Alex's power would work very well for a murder mystery, but the game doesn't really explore them to their greatest potential, because there's no time for that when you're LARPing. Wait, you know what? They could have even been used here. Imagine for a second that Alex hears Jed's thoughts while LARPing in episode 3. Jed slips up about his plan to stop Alex, and the player has to decide whether to pressure Jed into telling the truth or just playing along so Ethan's day isn't ruined, while also hoping that Jed would give additional information since he's not suspicious. As I said before, mind reading is a great power for a murder mystery. But unfortunately, Alex's power isn't mind reading, it's empathy. And with a power like that, she's definitely gotta have some good romance, right? Right? In this game, we once again only have 2 options. We can romance the forward-thinking, outspoken, loyal, D&D-loving friend-to-all creatures, Steph, or or Ryan. He likes animals, and nature, and he might be asexual. He's kind of quirky too, but like, who isn't in these games? I'm sorry, Ryan's just not as interesting as Steph. A lot of his character is implied through items you find and a few text messages, and, well, he's the hardest character to get on your side at the end of the game, which becomes especially weird if the player chooses to romance him during their playthrough. Oh, what's that? You don't want to romance either Steph or Ryan? Well, you don't have to. Unlike Life is Strange 2, they don't just throw Cassidy at you even if you don't romance her. Anyway, between the two, Steph seems to make more sense narratively. And don't worry, I'll get to her later. As far as choices are concerned, they matter in their own respective circles, but not all together. The game has crucial decisions be character-specific rather than story-specific. The only time your choices with each character start to affect the plot is at the very end, when characters are siding with Alex. But even then, it kinda doesn't matter, cause Alex gets the final choice regardless. Life is Strange 1 balanced plot and character events pretty well, so even if a character wasn't directly involved with the murder mystery, they at the very least contributed to the tone and atmosphere, even giving you an idea of why a side character would feel the way they do. Everyone knows about Rachel Ambers, Nathan Prescott, and even Mark Jefferson. Characters have their own lives that you can get involved with, but if you choose not to, it doesn't destroy the whole plot. Life is Strange 2 had a similar approach to True Colors. Focusing exclusively on our two central characters, every episode felt disconnected from one another, but the choices made within those episodes actually affected how our two main characters interacted with each other. If Sean spends more time with Cassidy, siding with her at every given opportunity, Daniel accuses Sean of letting her change him, leading Daniel to turn against Sean more often, thus leading to one of the 7 different endings seen in the finale. But True Colors feels so unfocused. All the interesting plot elements happen off-screen. It's like we were dropped into a story full of robust characters after they've gone through so much development, which is why they had to kill Gabe, so that everyone could be sad about it and Alex would try to fix it. But whether or not Alex does fix it only really affects the ending. And, the ending isn't bad, it's quite interesting, really. Alex, a character who spends a majority of the game at the mercy of others' feelings, finally expresses herself and puts her feelings onto another person. One could argue that Alex develops through these characters and their interactions, but the problem is, she gets to the same conclusion with or without them. If you don't solve their problems, the ending is the same. If we forgive Jed, he cries. If we condemn Jed, he cries. If you tell Gabe about your powers, he dies. And if you don't tell him about your powers, he's still too dead to tell anybody else. If anything, it's better not to tell him, cause then you get some insight into their home life. Speaking of which, your final decision is to either stay in Haven Springs or leave Haven Springs, with or without your lover, technically giving you 6 endings, but again, the only variation is whether or not Alex is with someone when she chooses where to go. You know, it's a good thing this game didn't release episodically, because I think I'd be disappointed with the lack of development episode to episode. Could you imagine coming up with theories about what might happen in episode 3, only to be disappointed once you discover that it's just LARPing? The first 3 episodes of Life is Strange 1 had a great deal of build-up surrounding them. Sure, the last 2 episodes kinda died down with all the padding, but at least new things were being learned. Life is Strange 2 opened doors for even crazier ideas, since the characters weren't limited to one location. But unfortunately, that also led to some players losing interest, because of how sporadic and disconnected each episode felt. So this game was released all at once to remedy that, and I don't know, it just doesn't feel as well planned out. Why is the story about Alex's family at the end of the game? At least the soundtrack is good. If you don't have it on streamer mode, that is. Speaking of soundtrack, have you ever wanted to be a radio DJ playing music in a tiny record store? Have I got the game for you? In all seriousness, Wavelengths is a prequel DLC to True Colors. Finally, we get to see characters' backstories and dive deeper into what made them who they are. Right? Nah. We play as Steph Gingrich after she gets a job in the record store. Most of the game is in first person, so they didn't have to animate anything. Fortunately, Steph is a fun character, so any shortcomings this DLC has is remedied by her performance. But you want to know what's really weird about this DLC? For most of it, we're just doing things around the shop, texting potential lovers, and advertising sponsors. But then, out of literally nowhere, the game decides to be interesting. Steph struggles with PTSD from either the storm that killed her parents or the cause of Chloe's death, depending on which choice you made in Life is Strange 1. At the beginning of Life is Strange True Colors, Steph played the role of the confident, sarcastic, and upbeat member of the gang, but after Gabe's death, Steph slowly begins to break down. After Alex comforts her, Steph vows to have her back no matter what. Interesting that for the rest of the game, Alex is the only character Steph opens up to. Is it because Alex was the only one to find Steph during her moment of weakness, or is Steph clinging to her good friend Gabe's little sister now that he's passed away as a sort of coping mechanism? Interestingly, you can look at this in multiple ways, but in Wavelengths, or rather 2 scenes in Wavelengths, we learn more about why Steph would be so quick to cling to Alex specifically. Sure, on the surface, Steph seems self-assured and ready to tackle anything, but deep down, she burdens herself with the misguided belief that she's not good enough. Reading through her relationship profiles makes it evident that Steph tends to push people away the moment they start to show any attraction. Because she loses everyone she loves, if Max saves Arcadia Bay, then Steph loses Chloe. If Max saves Chloe, then Steph loses her family. Sure, these two are determinant, but you know who's not? Steph's biggest crush, Rachel Ambers. And even though these deaths happened years ago, Steph's still traumatized by them. Her best friend Mikey is the only one she can talk to about it, but the two don't live anywhere near each other, so she forms a close relationship with Gabe. But then he dies, creating yet another void in Steph's life. But before she can completely shut down and isolate herself for good, a small glimmer of hope comes her way, and its name is Alex Chen. Alex is Steph's second chance, and this is perfectly illustrated by having Steph and Alex play foosball together, seeing as how foosball was the game Steph and Gabe used to play together. That's why Steph promises to always be loyal to Alex. That's why Steph puts her guards down around Alex, and that's why Steph gets jealous if Alex puts her focus on Ryan instead of her. It's worth noting that Steph is the only non-hetero love interest that doesn't force the player to do bad things. Wavelengths gives us deeper insight into Steph through context. Too bad Wavelengths sucks! This game is a 4-hour job simulator that contributes little to nothing to the actual story. Going into this, I was very happy to play as Steph because next to Max, I think she's my favorite character in the franchise. She's definitely the most relatable for me, and as my Twitch followers will know, I discovered that while streaming.
Her problems, but then she like drills them in every now and then. It's like, I suck. Like, she's so self-deprecating sometimes. Like, she's always... I think my problem with Steph is that I'm too similar to her. She seems to hate on herself a lot, but then boast about other people. It's weird.
Seriously, follow me on Twitch, I've been streaming weekly. The only other thing worth mentioning is Steph's superpower, the ability to see the future. Kind of. After being on the radio for a while, Steph creates a gimmick out of reading fortunes by rolling her d20. Did I mention she likes Dungeons & Dragons? Don't worry, the game will remind you. Anyway, Steph predicts people's future based on what number she lands on. The player chooses her approach, but once again, the choices don't matter. What's really strange is that one of the callers is Gabe. He asks Steph how things will go once his sister returns, and Steph can basically tell him what will happen. Except for, you know, his death. Honestly, the game could have ended right here, but then it just keeps going, and honestly, I think that's a recurring problem with the series. All this padding. Interacting with characters is good, especially for a character-driven franchise, but when the player is tasked with doing mind-numbingly simple tasks at the cost of any actual plot development, all they get is a big game with little substance. Because of the varying reception for every game after the first one, it's starting to feel like the Life is Strange team has run out of ideas for where to take the series. So, what the heck, here's my idea. Episode 1, Epiphany, opens with a midnight establishing shot of our new protagonist, Darcy Andrews, the mischievous and motivated leader of her team of troublemakers. The player takes control of her as she slowly approaches a convenience store. While this is happening, dialogue plays through her head. Different voices are heard discussing a plan to rob the place. Characters argue about how and why they're doing it, but Darcy's voice silences them all. The player is then prompted with the choice of either giving an inspiring speech about her team being more like a family to her, or making Darcy tell her whole team to shut up and follow her orders, because her plans always work. Right off the bat, literally in the introduction, player choice matters. The player decides what kind of leader Darcy is going to be. Empathetic, sociopathic, or maybe even a bit of both. But since this is internal dialogue from the past, technically it's establishing who she is before the game even starts. And don't worry, this won't just be a good or evil choice-based game. Remember, she's about to rob a store. Anyway, the team rallies with Darcy in her head just as she reaches the front door. But before opening it, she puts in her earbuds, pulls out her phone, and the player is prompted to push the designated superpower button. Darcy does the iconic hand reach the series is known for and hits the play button with her other hand, and the song that plays is Junk by Destroy Boys. Yes, it's a punk rock song, and yes, there will be indie music later on. I think the music in Life is Strange could be used for more than just establishing shots. Instead, why not have the music begin with a darker and harsher soundtrack that gradually shifts into a lighter, softer tone as the story progresses, as a way of meeting different story beats, letting the music tell a story. It could totally work here. Anyway, Darcy reaches her hand out and collapses to the ground. We have close-up shots of her body while a flickering light shines over her, with the credits appearing over different things as the camera slowly enters the store. When all of a sudden, her soul emerges inside the store. That's right, Darcy's Life is Strange superpower is astral projection, the ability to separate one's soul from their body. Darcy's body is immobile when she uses this power, hence her collapsing. The player takes control of Darcy's soul inside the convenience store, where she sees her team of misfits, each playing a different role in the heist. Ilara screams that she saw someone pass out in front of the store, prompting the store clerk to panic and check to see what happened. Trey pretends to be a disgruntled customer, telling the clerk to hurry up. He's doing this to distract the clerk from the fact that Lucas is stuffing snacks in his bag at the back corner of the store. The team planned things out so that they'd be the only customers there on a day where only one employee was working. The only problem is, they got the work schedules mixed up, so there is another employee there who comes out of the back room to see what's going on. But before he turns the corner to catch Lucas, bags of chips fall in front of him to slow him down. As the player will soon learn, Darcy's soul can interact with objects around her without anybody seeing her, so it's the player's job to mess around with the store and distract both store clerks so that the heist goes smoothly. This gives the player a chance to understand how Darcy's power works through gameplay rather than just a bunch of text explaining it. The player can try to move whatever they want in the store, but they'll see that Darcy's soul can only move small objects, pretty much anything under 5 pounds. She'll phase right through anything heavier. Ultimately, there are 3 outcomes for this opening heist. Either A, Darcy doesn't distract well enough, causing Lucas to get spotted stealing, leading to an altercation and the team having to retreat, without getting everything they needed. B, Darcy's soul makes too much noise, causing the store clerk checking on her body outside to come back in and tell everyone to leave. Lucas doesn't get spotted this time, but the team still didn't get everything they needed. Or C. Darcy's soul does just the right amount of distracting that the team gets what they want, and no one gets spotted. Either way, Darcy's soul reaches her hand out and returns to her body. The team gets out, they hop into Trey's car, and either celebrate or panic. Trey worries about camera footage, but Ilara mentions the neighborhood is too poor to afford working cameras, meaning those cameras we saw during the credits are fake. Darcy asks Lucas if he got everything, and we smash cut to a shot of Lucas pouring out the food from his bag, and the team reacting based on what transpired in the store. In Darcy's apartment, the team talks about their next move. Lucas, being arrogant and hot-headed, exclaims that they should just keep the food for themselves. Trey, being neurotic and worrisome, disagrees and wants them to get rid of the evidence. But Ilara, being dicey and forceful, tells Darcy they should throw a party with some people in the neighborhood. The player is then prompted to pick Lucas's plan, Trey's plan, Ilara's plan, or Darcy's plan. Yes, Darcy will have her own plan too. Her plan is to give all the food to the homeless in the neighborhood. The player's choice determines what kind of person Darcy will be, adding bits of dialogue for later segments, as well as who Darcy can potentially romance. Yeah, you can date your teammates in this, and you can even cheat on them. But of course, these actions will have consequences, leading to a different team dynamic whenever the team is together in later episodes. After Darcy makes a decision on what to do, we transition back to the convenience store, now with the police car outside. The two clerks tell an officer what happened. When they mention floating bags of chips, the officer uses his walkie-talkie to tell his partner, who's been waiting in the car this whole time, to come inside. The car door opens and out comes our second playable character, Officer Vanessa Sanabria. The player is given control of her as she walks inside the store to investigate. After asking for their names, the player can ask questions about anything they want to while investigating, and Vanessa will take notes. After the two officers finish their investigation, they return to the vehicle. Her partner, Officer Ken Blanche, asks if she believes them, to which Vanessa responds with, "I'll believe it when I see it." The player is then prompted to push the designated superpower button, and suddenly, the game is in first person, from one of the store clerk's perspectives. Confused? Vanessa's power is clairvoyance, or more specifically, remote viewing. Basically, she can see and hear from other people's perspective as long as she knows their name and face. She can't control what the person does, she's just taking a back seat inside their head. This may not seem useful, but she uses this ability to see and hear the conversation between the two clerks once they think the cops are gone. Fortunately, the clerks don't say anything inconsistent with the investigation, so the cops leave. So, if you haven't noticed, this would be the first Life is Strange game with two superpowered characters, each acting as a foil to the other. Darcy's an outlaw with the intrusive power of astral projection, while Vanessa's an officer of the law with the passive power of clairvoyance. We return to Darcy and the gang, doing whatever plan the player chose. If they go with Trey's plan to return the food, they'll just be repacking it. While doing that, Darcy tells the team they should come up with a name. Until now, they've just been calling themselves the team, but Darcy wants something more official. So, conversations start, and the player is given different name options based on the conversation. This name will carry on through the rest of the game. After deciding, Darcy makes a plan for where the gang can steal from next, and together they choose Bear Station, the gas station from Life is Strange 2. We stylishly transition back to the apartment where the player assigns roles to everyone on the team. Sure, the strategy is the same, but this time the player decides on who does what. Who panics about Darcy's fallen body, who acts as the disgruntled customer, and who steals the food. Nobody wants to be the one who steals the food. After the plan is made, Darcy can chat with each member for a bit. Extra conversation routes will be available for whoever she sided with previously. All the conversations have the other teammates ask Darcy if she's okay after using her powers for so long. They can even ask questions about her powers that might be on their mind. The next morning, we follow Vanessa as she submits her police report about powered individuals to the chief of police. She claims that she has reports of a man with telekinesis, a girl who can control fire, a woman who can read minds, a man who can turn invisible, and a woman who can teleport. Think about it, no one would really know what Max's power is. And before you say it, yes, I know Rachel is dead, but still, the police report would exist. The chief of police finally gives her approval to investigate further, and she rejoices. We go back to Darcy and the gang, and they're chilling around the neighborhood. Here, the player can explore and interact with different people in the area, and if you think this is just a cheap and easy way to world build, you're wrong, because Darcy encourages the team to form alibis for where they'd be on the night of their next heist. It makes sense for them to be social butterflies. Anyway, they socialize and Vanessa does research on the whereabouts of the previous protagonists. Night falls and Vanessa leaves her apartment to get some coffee. On her way out, she bumps into Darcy and her gang. They all have a confrontational dialogue and go their separate ways. Darcy and the gang get to Bear Station and begin their heist to the tune of Dip by THC. But everything goes horribly. Whoever the player chose to steal the snacks gets shot by Hank, and Doris locks the doors and alerts the police. The gang gets arrested. Each member is interrogated by Ken and Vanessa. During Darcy's interrogation, Vanessa asks to be alone with her. She starts questioning whether or not Darcy has powers, to which Darcy completely denies. After Vanessa leaves, Darcy puts her head on the table and reaches her hand out. The player can then explore the police station as Darcy's soul to see what's going on. While exploring, Darcy will find a handcuff key and Vanessa's files on powered individuals around the world. She'll slide the key along the floor to avoid suspicion and bring it into the interrogation room. After freeing herself and returning to her body, she'll do the same for her teammates, who will then make a break for it. On their way out, though, Darcy will steal Vanessa's files. The team will regroup outside Darcy's apartment for one last time, because as of today, they're wanted criminals. Darcy hatches a plan to find the powered individuals so she and her team can make the world their bit busboy. They get in Trey's car and drive away, but then we zoom out from Trey's perspective and see that Vanessa was using her powers to see and hear their plan the whole time. So now, both Darcy and Vanessa are on a hunt for the previous protagonists for different reasons, and that is how I'd end episode 1. Now, I have plenty of ideas for episodes 2 and 3. Yes, there'd only be 3 episodes, so we could avoid all that padding, but I'll save that for another time. Or, alternatively, in the off chance that someone working on the Life is Strange franchise sees this, maybe I could use my idea for the next game. Square Enix, Deck 9, and Don't Nod Entertainment, if you're listening, hire me. Please? Come on, I unironically love the Life is Strange franchise, and I understand what works and what doesn't work for characters narratively, and I made a long video about your game on the 7-year anniversary of said game. I've made my move, now you make yours.